Good evening, mates. Welcome to Historian's Lullaby. Please let us know in the comments where you are in the world and why you're still awake. Tonight, as you settle into stillness and prepare to drift into the gentler realms of sleep, I invite you to journey with me into the Appalachian frontier, to a time and place where the scent of black powder mingled with blooming dogwood, where the dense woods whispered secrets older than the Constitution, and where one man, an unpredictable, sharp-tongued, altogether legendary man named John Sevier, also known as Nolichucky Jack, decided that 13 states just weren't enough. Yes, while we have heard of the original 13 colonies of the US that vied for statehood after the War for Independence, there existed a 14th that was almost lost to history. This is the story of that 14th state, called Franklin. A state that existed, sort of. It breathed. It sputtered. It fought. It drank. It argued with itself and with Congress. And then it disappeared into the mist of history, like so many frontier dreams. So grab a warm drink, dim the lights, and let the tale unfold slowly, like smoke from a cedarwood fire curling into the Appalachian dawn. John Sevier was not born in a log cabin, but he might as well have been. Born in 1745 in the rolling hills of Augusta County, Virginia, young Sevier's early world was stitched together from the coarse wool of frontier hardship, the iron scent of rifle barrels, and the endless hymns of wind through the highland trees. His father, Valentine Sevier, a French Huguenot by ancestry, ran a tavern, one of those rowdy colonial watering holes where musket smoke mingled with spilled ale and local gossip. John grew up in a place where walls were thin, and tempers thinner. He learned early how to read people's eyes before their mouths, how to duck a swinging tankard, and how to charm a room before it turned against you. By 17, he had married Sarah Hawkins and opened a tavern of his own. But the dream of static roots never fit him. The young man was restless, infected with the peculiar fever that gripped so many Americans of his era, westward longing. The West, of course, was not California. It was not even Kentucky. It was the barely settled, thickly forested, mist-draped valleys of what is now eastern Tennessee, near the Nolichucky River, a place so wild, so ripe with danger and opportunity, that it seemed to exist on the edge of myth. John went there, as all good legends do, half in pursuit of land and half in pursuit of something he couldn't quite name. But when he arrived, the land named him. Nolichucky Jack. The river, whose name came from the Cherokee word for rushing water, curved like a silver blade through the hills. It was alive with trout, with mist in the mornings, and with the occasional scream of conflict as settlers pushed further into native lands. Sevier built a homestead near the riverbanks, where mornings began with the smell of wood smoke and dew on leather boots, and evenings ended with rifles loaded and children held close. He was not alone on the frontier. There were others, fierce women and harder men, the kind of people who buried children before 20 and built cabins with their bare hands. But even among them, Sevier stood out. He had style. He dressed well, even on the frontier. Where others wore rough buckskins, Sevier might be found in a ruffled shirt or a tailored coat, provided he hadn't torn it riding through briar patches. He had a fondness for horses, storytelling, and public applause. He didn't just lead militias, he gave speeches while doing it. He didn't just survive battles, he made sure you remembered who led the charge. He was a flirt, a father of 13, and a compulsive duelist. He duelled over honor, over politics, even over jokes. But always with flair. The land shaped him, and he shaped the land. Nolichucky Jack began carving roads with axes and treaties with charm. He knew the Cherokee, sometimes fought them, sometimes traded with them. He built forts and organized militias. He held court under oak trees. He settled disputes with laughter or gunpowder, depending on the mood. And the people loved him. They didn't love many people. Out there, survival didn't leave room for admiration. But Sevier had that rare, inexplicable magnetism. He made people feel like the world was theirs for the taking, even when wolves howled outside and winter closed its grip. By the 1770s, as whispers of rebellion reached even the most remote homesteads, Sevier was already a legend in progress. His exploits at the Battle of Kings Mountain, more on that soon, would seal his name in the annals of revolutionary folklore. But even before the war, he was a commander, not by appointment, but by presence. Life on the Nolichucky was not comfortable. It was blood and bone, sweat and pee. But it had its moments. The forests were thick with oak and hickory, the trails scented with pine and musk. Bears still roamed the hills, and so did mountain lions. The stars were unblotted by city light, and campfires glowed like holy altars in the night. One can imagine Sevier on such a night, seated by the fire, coat unbuttoned, boots dusty, retelling some impossible tale about chasing bandits across a swollen river or negotiating with a Cherokee chief using only whiskey and wit. The children would have leaned in. The men would have nodded. And the women? Well, Sevier was never short on admirers. But beneath the charm was a calculating mind. He understood that this untamed land was both opportunity and trap. If you didn't claim it, someone else would. And if you didn't organize, chaos would do the organizing for you. So Nolichucky Jack did more than fight. He surveyed. He mapped. He wrote letters. He lobbied. He didn't just want land, he wanted a future. A place where backward settlers could live with dignity and laws of their own making. The seed of Franklin, though still dormant, was already there. In his charisma. In his restlessness. In his love of the land and his hatred of distant authority. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, know this, before the state, before the rebellion, before the shootouts and political theater, there was a man. A real man, with real boots and a temper like spring lightning. A man forged by river mist, midnight duels, and the stubborn belief that the people of the backcountry deserved a voice. Nolichucky Jack had arrived. and the frontier would never be the same. The Appalachian frontier in the late 18th century was less a place and more a state of mind, a fevered dream of freedom wrapped in buckskin and stitched with stubbornness. There were no street signs, few sheriffs, and even fewer saints. What there was, however, was a chorus of gunfire, fiddle music, and the steady rhythm of axes carving homes out of wilderness. Imagine the world as it must have felt then, crisp pine-scented air in the mornings, the tang of wood smoke and tannin rising from fresh-cut logs. The scent of leather mixed with sweat and the iron bite of flintlock powder. Trails were little more than widened deer paths, and the nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away or 100 yards too close. This was the wild land where John Sevier thrived. But it wasn't an easy land to love. For all its beauty, it was also a crucible of violence, uncertainty, and contradiction. There was no official government to speak of, only loose bands of settlers creating ad hoc legal systems and frontier codes of honor enforced with rifle barrels and broadsides. The indigenous tribes of the region, the Cherokee most prominently, had lived in the valleys and ridges long before the settlers arrived. To them, these forests were not empty, but sacred. Hunting grounds, burial places, ancient trails. And suddenly, people like Sevier and his neighbors were carving homesteads into their world. Conflict was inevitable. Sometimes it came with diplomacy and trade. More often, it came in the form of torchlit raids, stolen livestock, and tragic misunderstandings that turned into blood feuds. Yet the settlers saw themselves as embattled and righteous. They believed they had carved their lives from nothing, though it wasn't nothing, it was someone else's everything. To navigate such chaos, leaders emerged, not by appointment, but by acclaim. And in this raucous theater of survival, John Sevier was not just a character. He was the headliner. He had the rare skill of uniting the deeply divided, farmers and traders, former soldiers and current moonshiners, Baptists and backsliders. He wasn't a preacher, but he could hold a crowd like one. He wasn't a general, yet, but he rode like thunder and shot like lightning. More importantly, he knew how to organize. In an era where laws were more suggestion than statute, Sevier pushed for structured defense, elected judges, rudimentary courts, even land surveys. He believed the frontier didn't have to be forever lawless. It could be wild and orderly, like a well-tamed horse that still kicked once in a while just to remind you. Settlements sprang up with names that sound invented by whiskey: Greenville, Jonesboro, Watauga. They were clusters of cabins, muddy lanes, and smoky hearths, but they were also the seeds of community. Some settlers dreamed of statehood. Others just wanted a safe place to raise pigs. And then there was the liquor. Moonshine was more than drink. It was commerce, comfort, and currency. It was also a ticking powder keg. Distilleries, legal or otherwise, were scattered through the hills like mushrooms after rain. Homemade stills clanked and hissed in forest clearings. Bartering a jar of shine for a pair of boots or a rifle repair was as common as sunrise. And where there was liquor, there was politics. Every man in the back country considered himself a philosopher, a politician, and occasionally a prophet. Elections were lively, to say the least. Ballot boxes were sometimes gunpowder kegs in disguise. Votes might be bought with drink, promises, or pure charisma. And Sevier? He won with a smile and a story. He was often elected to leadership not because he demanded it, but because no one could out-talk him or outshoot him. He had a memory for names, a laugh that carried, and the unnerving ability to diffuse a tense room with a quip just before someone reached for their rifle. Let's paint a picture of a backcountry courtroom in those days, say, somewhere near Jonesboro. The structure is little more than logs notched and stacked, a roof of shingles made from split trees. The benches are hard, and the air smells of old tobacco, sweat, and earth. Chickens might wander through mid-testimony. The judge? Probably a local farmer with more wisdom than teeth. The jury? Anyone sober enough to stay awake. And if John Sevier was present, he might be defending, prosecuting, or simply storytelling from the back row, swaying the crowd like a fireside bard. Disputes ranged from stolen hogs to accusations of land fraud. And justice? Well, it leaned heavily on local sympathies and who owed who a favor. But it was something. It was the beginning of governance. And at the center of this loud, muddy, fragrant new world stood Sevier, balancing law with law, order with instinct. He was becoming more than a man. He was becoming a symbol. Yet danger was constant. Settlers built blockhouses, defensive log structures with tiny rifle ports, where families would retreat during raids. The nights could be long, lit only by the flickering of hearth flames and the occasional thunder of musket fire echoing from across the hills. Children grew up with loaded rifles next to their cradles. Women churned butter while watching the tree line for movement. Men often returned from hunting trips with game in one hand and a tale of near death in the other. This environment bred resilience, but also paranoia. And charisma went a long way in keeping a community from falling into disrepair or open rebellion. Sevier's charisma, though, was not just for local show. Word of his leadership began to ripple beyond the valleys. Traders spoke of him as a man of action and charm. Soldiers remembered his quick decision-making and his even quicker trigger finger. And Congress, miles and miles away, began to hear murmurs of a new leader in the Western Territories. Not a governor, not officially, but something like it. A man who ruled not by decree, but by applause. As tensions rose, between settlers and native tribes, between Eastern governments and Western hopes, Sevier found himself balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move could mean war. Or worse, irrelevance. But he kept riding. Kept building. Kept calling meetings in churchyards and fields, proposing courts and militias, sketching plans for a future that wasn't just about survival, but about dignity. It said that Sevier once addressed a town gathering standing on the back of a wagon, rain pouring down, hat in hand, coat drenched, eyes blazing. His voice, one witness wrote, cut through the storm like it was born of it. People listened. Not because he yelled, but because he believed. Because he painted a vision of the back country not as a burden, but as a birthright. It was this vision, this fire and stubborn faith, that would soon inspire something mad, something rebellious, something beautiful and doomed. The state of Franklin. But before the paperwork and the battles, before the petitions and the public floggings, there was this moment, the wild, the lawless, and the loud, stitched together by the voices of a people too proud to be forgotten and too restless to stay put. And their leader? A man born of the back country, fluent in its chaos, fearless in its defense. Nolichucky Jack. The rattling bones of revolution did not cease their clamor just because the cannons had stopped. For John Sevier, the rumblings of liberty didn't begin at Lexington or end at Yorktown. They echoed in the gorges of the Appalachian Mountains and hummed like a ghost fiddle across the dark waters of the Nolichucky. By the late 1770s, the firebrand spirit of independence had spread beyond Boston tea houses and Philadelphia parchment. It seeped into the mud-churned fields and smoky cabins of the backwoods, where life was already hard, and grievances against far-off kings felt more personal than political. The war wasn't an abstraction out here, it was an extension of a daily fight for survival. Out in the over-mountain territory, a rebellious energy surged like the river that bore Sevier's nickname. It wasn't the British taxes they resented so much as the British distance. And when orders from colonial governors or generals took too long or came too late, men like Sevier simply made their own. It was in this gritty context that John Sevier rose not only as a community leader but as a battle-tested hero. Let's set the stage. The year was 1780. The Revolution was dragging into its 6th year, and the British had turned their gaze southward. Major Patrick Ferguson, a confident and calculated officer of the Crown, had taken up the task of subduing the restless backcountry folk, those ragged mountain men who flouted law, laughed at uniforms, and, most galling of all, didn't seem to recognize their proper place in the empire. Ferguson, with the smooth condescension of an imperial officer, sent out a warning: if the over-mountain men didn't cease their rebellion, he would march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. Now, if Ferguson had wanted to provoke them, he couldn't have chosen better words if he'd tried. Because among those over-mountain men was John Sevier, who didn't like threats, didn't take orders, and certainly wasn't about to let some red-coated officer tell him what could and could not be set on fire. He rallied the men. They gathered at Sycamore Shoals, a broad sweep of land beside the Watauga River where the air was crisp and the scent of autumn carried the dry promise of frost. They came on foot and horseback, from hollers and homesteads, with long rifles slung over shoulders and powder horns swinging at their hips. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They wore hunting shirts, coonskin caps, and homespun breeches. Their boots were worn, their faces weathered, but their resolve was flint hard. and John Sevier stood among them, his voice rising above the crackle of fire and the murmurs of preparation. They set out, about 900 strong, over the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a brutal, beautiful journey. The trail twisted like a serpent through narrow passes and dense groves of laurel. The air grew thin, and the ground slick with the breath of morning fog. They moved in near silence, each man alone in his thoughts, yet bound by a common purpose, to bring the fight to Ferguson. And they found him at King's Mountain, a rocky hilltop in South Carolina, shrouded with oak and pine. Ferguson's position seemed solid, until it wasn't. The over-mountain men encircled the hill like wolves around a bear. They didn't march in lines. They didn't fire volleys. They stalked from tree to tree, using the land like a second weapon. Sevier led from the front. Always. Bullets cracked like splitting timber, smoke rolled through the underbrush, and the smell, oh, the smell, was of wet soil, sweat, blood, and sulfur. The battle didn't last long. Ferguson, stubborn to the end, refused to surrender and died on the hill, reportedly shot so many times his body was barely recognizable. It was a turning point. One of the few battles of the Revolution fought entirely between Americans, loyalists against patriots, and it sent a shockwave through the British ranks. But for Sevier, King's Mountain was more than a military victory. It was a declaration. It told the world that the people beyond the mountains were not just squatters or vagrants, they were a force. Capable, cohesive, fiercely proud. And it made Sevier a legend. His name was whispered in the same breath as Washington's in taverns west of the Appalachians. He was no mere frontiersman now. He was a war hero, a symbol of what ungoverned freedom could accomplish when cornered. And yet, victory brought its own complications. The revolution ended. The British left. And in the quiet that followed, the question arose, what now? The federal government was young and weak, still figuring out how to keep 13 states together without offending any of them. The Western territories, like the one Sevier called home, were too far away to be properly governed, yet too important to be ignored. And here is where our tale begins to twist. For John Sevier had caught the scent of independence. And like a bloodhound with something thrilling in his nostrils, he couldn't let it go. The revolution had given birth to a nation. But what if it could give birth to another one? A state made by frontiersmen, for frontiersmen? A land not managed by distant assemblies or eastern elites but led by those who knew the lay of the land, the ridge lines, the river bends, and the people. What if King's Mountain was not the end, but the beginning? The dream of Franklin had not yet been spoken aloud. But it was there, in the crackle of the fires at Sevier's winter camp, in the sighing wind that rustled through the chestnut trees, in the look exchanged between weather-beaten men who had seen the war and didn't want to give up their autonomy now. So Sevier, the warrior, began to become something new. A politician. And not the polished kind. He didn't deliver speeches in powdered wigs or trade favors in candlelit chambers. His campaign trail was a muddy wagon road. His platform was survival and pride. His voter base? Every man who had ever felt ignored by the capital. He understood that freedom wasn't something given. It had to be seized, carried like a musket, etched into the land like initials carved into an old oak tree. And that's what he intended to do. With King's Mountain behind him and a restless republic around him, Sevier began to gather support. Quietly at first, then with increasing momentum. And somewhere, in the dim firelit corners of his mind, he began to see it. A new state. A new name. Franklin. Let's rewind just a bit, back to the uncertain days after the American Revolution, when the ink on the Treaty of Paris was still drying and the new United States was figuring out how to hold itself together like a quilt of mismatched patches. The frontier, those smoky mountains and tangled river valleys that people like John Sevier called home, was a wild card. And in this fresh, chaotic, freedom-drunk republic, wild cards were both thrilling and terrifying. Now, North Carolina, like many of the original states, had a bit of a real estate problem. It claimed lands far to the west, even beyond the Appalachian Mountains, lands it barely governed and hardly protected. Imagine a landlord who doesn't even remember he owns the property, and you've got the situation. These distant western settlements were full of folks who had fought in the Revolution, who had carved homes from the wilderness, and who weren't too keen on being forgotten now that the war was over. John Sevier and his kin were among them. But North Carolina wasn't doing these settlers any favors. Their taxes were collected when collectors dared to venture that far, and in return, the frontier got little in the way of roads, security, or political representation. Cherokee raids were a constant threat, and the federal government, still a fragile idea held together with sealing wax and borrowed coin, offered no protection. In 1784, weary of the burden and maybe just a touch cheap, North Carolina decided to solve the problem in the simplest way imaginable, by giving it all away. Yes, they just ceded their western lands to the federal government. With a letter, a vote, and a wish, they declared, "You take it. We're done." To the folks on the ground, this was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because now they had no official government. Liberating, because, well, now they had no official government. For men like Sevier, who were used to leading militias, running impromptu court sessions, and negotiating with tribes on their own terms, this was a tantalizing moment. The chains were off. The mountains echoed with possibility. And so, the settlers convened. They held a series of meetings, and one name kept rising to the surface: Franklin. Named not for the region, but in honor of Benjamin Franklin, because even on the frontier, name-dropping helps. Did they ask Franklin if he wanted a state named after him? No. Did they think he would be flattered enough to support them? Absolutely. Sevier was elected governor almost by default. He was the obvious choice, the war hero, the landowner, the duelist, the backwoods aristocrat with a twinkle in his eye and a knife in his boot. And thus, the state of Franklin was born. Not with fanfare, not with congressional approval, but with sheer mountain stubbornness. The people of Franklin were a peculiar blend of hopeful idealists and dangerously well-armed cynics. Most were Scots-Irish immigrants or descendants of German, Dutch, and English settlers who'd moved westward to escape what they saw as overreaching colonial governments. They hadn't come all this way to be bossed around again. These were not the type of people who appreciated bureaucrats. Still, there had to be some central hub of government. The proposed capital? Jonesboro. A muddy little town with crooked wooden buildings, pigs wandering the streets, and grand ideas of self-governance. The courthouse was more barn than government building. Still, they had structure. They drafted a constitution. They set up courts. They levied taxes, though collecting them was another matter entirely. The people of Franklin weren't unified in vision, but they shared a hunger for agency. They were tired of being someone else's afterthought. Unfortunately, North Carolina changed its mind. Just months after ceding the land, the legislature realized they might have been a little hasty. Perhaps they missed the tax revenue. Perhaps they feared the rise of an unregulated frontier state. Or perhaps they just didn't like the idea of mountain folk making their own rules. So North Carolina said, "Actually, never mind," and reclaimed the land. Imagine the whiplash. One moment you're abandoned. The next, you're being told to return to the fold like a child caught playing dress-up. But Franklin wasn't ready to give up its paper crown. Letters were written. Speeches made. Delegates were sent to Congress with hat in hand and hope in heart, seeking official recognition. They were turned away, politely, firmly, and completely. The reason? They couldn't get the 2/3 majority required for statehood. Some states didn't want to set a precedent. Others feared a breakup of their own western lands. And, perhaps, some just found the whole affair a little too rustic. Franklin, it seemed, would remain a ghost, real to those who lived it, invisible to everyone else. But Sevier pressed on. He governed. He negotiated with the Cherokee, sometimes with success, sometimes with bloodshed. He issued land grants and resolved disputes. He tried, oh, how he tried, to act like a real governor of a real state. Yet cracks appeared. Some settlers never fully embraced Franklin's legitimacy. A pro-North Carolina faction grew, led by men who saw more stability in the old state government than in Sevier's mountain republic. These weren't just political differences, they were deeply personal. One such opponent was Colonel John Tipton, a man every bit as ornery as Sevier but without the charm. Where Sevier had flair, Tipton had law. Where Sevier smiled through conflict, Tipton growled. The feud between Sevier and Tipton would eventually explode. Guns drawn, houses surrounded, prisoners taken. But that's a story for later. Back in Jonesboro, the state of Franklin limped along. The settlers were resourceful but divided. Their currency was unreliable. Their legal codes inconsistent. Some counties functioned better than others. Communication between them was patchy, at best. And always, over their heads, loomed the knowledge that Congress had said no, and North Carolina had said no, and that no amount of homemade declarations could change that. Still, Sevier stood tall. He wore the trappings of office with pride, signed proclamations with a flourish, and held his court as if Washington himself might show up to tip his hat in approval. But the wind was shifting. And in those misty hollows and ridge-top cabins, people began to wonder, was this dream fading? Were they truly free, or just pretending? They had defied a state. They had defied a nation. And now they had to decide, would they keep pushing forward into uncertainty, or turn back toward the safety of the familiar? That question would soon boil over into conflict. Neighbors would take sides. Guns would be loaded. And the ideals of liberty and independence would be tested, not by foreign armies or tyrant kings, but by their own. Jonesboro, Tennessee. It wasn't Rome, it wasn't Paris, it wasn't even Philadelphia. But for a brief, audacious moment in American history, it was the capital of a would-be state, the heart of an experiment in rugged self-determination, and the pulsing center of the state of Franklin. Let's be honest, Jonesboro was more frontier outpost than shining city. Dust clung to everything. Chickens strutted through the muddy lanes as if they had business at the courthouse. Wagons groaned under the weight of hogs, sorghum, and homemade whiskey. The town smelled of smoke and pine, damp soil and animal sweat. Still, for the people of Franklin, it was home, and, for John Sevier, it was the seat of his unrecognized government. Jonesboro looked like rebellion made manifest in clapboard and grit. The courthouse, arguably the town's only public building of note, was a two-story affair with wide plank floors and windows that whistled in the wind. Court sessions were lively events, not just legal proceedings but social gatherings. Farmers came with disputes over pigs wandering through cornfields. Widows sought clarification on land grants hastily scribbled on scraps of parchment. Sometimes a trial would begin in the courthouse and end behind it, where fists and pistols did the talking. Sevier held court there, too, both legally and socially. His presence was magnetic. He wasn't just a war hero. He was a fixture of the frontier, the man who could settle a brawl with a wink or incite one with a grin. He moved through Jonesboro like it was his living room, nodding at blacksmiths, shaking hands with merchants, even helping widows unload firewood from their wagons. His charm was currency, and in Jonesboro it bought him loyalty. Of course, not everyone was buying. The divisions were growing. You could hear them in whispered conversations at the tavern and feel them in the uneasy silence when Tipton's name was mentioned. Yes, that John Tipton, the stone-faced loyalist to North Carolina, Sevier's political nemesis and future battlefield adversary. While Sevier and his followers worked tirelessly to enact laws, issue land grants, and collect taxes under Franklin's flag, Tipton and his faction insisted that Franklin was a delusion, a ghost state with no legal standing. In Tipton's view, the real capital was not Jonesboro but Hillsborough, back in North Carolina, and every law passed in Franklin's name was little more than a wilderness fantasy. Still, Jonesboro marched onward. The Franklin legislature met regularly, even if some of its members had to walk for 2 days to get there. Bills were passed. Some were practical, like establishing tax systems to pay for frontier defense. Others were less so. One law regulated stray livestock with penalties that included forced labor, an idea that sounded good until the town jail filled up with bewildered goats. The economy, such as it was, ran on barter. Cash was scarce. A man might pay his taxes with corn or bear pelts. The Franklin Treasury, a grand name for a box in the corner of the courthouse, was more likely to hold smoked ham than gold. Education, surprisingly, was a priority. Sevier, for all his backwoods bravado, believed deeply in learning. He advocated for schools, and in 1785, Franklin's legislature proposed the establishment of Greenville College, an audacious act for a government not even recognized by its own country. Still, classes were held. Books were shared. And in dim log cabins lit by candle stubs, young minds were shaped with Latin, logic, and revolutionary ideas. Franklin also tried to formalize relations with the Cherokee. Sevier understood the need for peace, if not out of moral principle, then out of military pragmatism. The treaties were uneven and often broken, but the attempt to engage diplomatically was real. For all its eccentricities, the state of Franklin was a functioning, if fragile, government. But pressure was mounting. North Carolina continued to press claims over the territory, issuing its own land grants and appointing officials to rival Franklin's. It was a tug-of-war where the rope was made of muskets and the stakes were survival. Tension simmered, and violence, long a background feature of frontier life, began to boil. Jonesboro became a town split by allegiance. One neighbor would raise a toast to Sevier, while another muttered darkly about Tipton. Friends became informants. Church meetings devolved into shouting matches. And at night, the only certainty was that the dogs would bark at something moving through the dark. Still, Sevier kept the facade polished. He wrote letters to Congress. He signed proclamations. He wore the governor's sash and convened the legislature. But there were cracks in the dream, and behind his ever-present smile, Sevier knew it. Supplies were thin. Franklin's militia, once proud and well-armed, now struggled to maintain basic readiness. Trade routes were unreliable. And the Cherokee, pushed too far, began to strike back. Franklin's defensive capacity was stretched thin, and appeals for federal aid went unanswered. Even worse, Congress had grown tired of Franklin's persistence. They ignored petitions. They avoided debate. Franklin wasn't just rejected, it was deliberately forgotten. Jonesborough's heart still beat, but it beat in time with a failing dream. By 1787, the cracks became canyons. More counties declared loyalty to North Carolina. Officials resigned their Franklin posts. Revenue dried up. Tipton seized state property. And one morning, Sevier arrived at the courthouse to find a warrant issued by North Carolina, demanding his arrest. But Jonesborough never stopped hoping. Even as Franklin faded, the town spirit remained. It would outlive the ghost state. It would survive Sevier's exile and eventual return. It would see the birth of Tennessee and stand as a reminder that even failed experiments are still part of the grander human story. Jonesborough today boasts the title of Tennessee's oldest town. Its streets are paved, its shops quaint, and its courthouse well kept. But if you stand quietly in the square at dusk, you can almost hear the echo of old boots on timber floors, the creak of wagon wheels, and the stubborn voice of a man who once dared to govern the ungovernable. The capital of Franklin, however briefly, mattered. And its story isn't over yet. The state of Franklin was never short on ambition. But ambition, no matter how spirited, doesn't pay for gunpowder or convince Congress to return your calls. And by the dawn of 1786, Franklin's troubles had grown from frontier squabbles to a full-blown identity crisis, a ghost state caught between ink-stained petitions and the steel of flintlocks. The problem was simple. No one in power wanted Franklin to exist. John Sevier, ever the optimist with a saber at his side and a quill in his hand, believed Franklin could still earn a place among the stars of the American flag. But belief alone wouldn't sway Congress. So Sevier did what any determined backwoods governor would do: he lobbied, begged, argued, and charmed. Letters were written in flowing script, sealed with wax, and entrusted to riders who galloped east through rain and snow, dodging Cherokee raids and river crossings, only to find Congress preoccupied with more pressing concerns like national debt and whether New York's postmaster had insulted a delegate's wig. Petition after petition arrived in Philadelphia like an uninvited guest at a formal dinner, awkward, persistent, and ignored. Franklin's case was compelling only to those who understood its desperation. The pleas came with promises. Franklin would contribute to the Confederation's coffers, honor existing land grants, maintain peaceful relations with neighboring tribes, and respect the rule of law. But Franklin had a branding problem. It looked, to the East Coast elite, like a rogue republic, another squatter kingdom carved out by men with muskets and egos. And so Congress stalled. For Sevier and his cabinet of weary lawmakers, the silence from Philadelphia was deafening. But frontier politics demanded action, even if it was symbolic. Franklin's legislature passed resolutions reaffirming their independence, redrew county lines to assert their authority, and printed official-looking documents on paper so coarse it could double as sandpaper. One of Franklin's more desperate innovations was the creation of a rudimentary treasury. Taxes, already unpopular, were now collected in kind: barrels of whiskey, sacks of grain, leather hides, and occasionally a live turkey. Auditors groaned. Bookkeepers invented categories like miscellaneous livestock and semi-fermented spirits. Even worse, North Carolina wasn't backing down. Far from conceding the land it had once ceded, North Carolina appointed rival officials to counties under Franklin's control. This meant that in some places, particularly the contested regions around Greene and Washington counties, there were 2 sets of judges, 2 sets of tax collectors, and twice the number of angry farmers. The result? Chaos. On one occasion, 2 tax collectors, one from Franklin and one from North Carolina, showed up at the same cabin to collect duties. The cabin's owner, a surly trapper named Abner, settled the matter by releasing a bull into the yard and retreating inside. The tax men fled in opposite directions, and Abner paid no one. Franklin pressed on. Foreign policy, such as it was, also suffered. The Cherokee were understandably skeptical of Franklin's legitimacy and less interested in its courtly assurances than its continued encroachment on tribal lands. Sevier, with his usual blend of negotiation and intimidation, attempted to secure treaties, some successful, others illusory. Treaties were signed in clearinghouses and under sycamores, then violated days later when settlers built cabins where no cabins should be. Meanwhile, Tipton and his allies were growing more confident. John Tipton's faction, backed by North Carolina's legislative muscle, began reclaiming courthouses, arresting Franklin officials, and tearing down Franklin's flags. Some records say Tipton himself traveled with a pocketful of North Carolina commissions and handed them out like candies at a fair. Sevier, never one to back down from a challenge, especially one wrapped in legalese, answered the only way he knew how: more declarations, more militia drills, and a few pointed warnings published in local gazettes. But even his supporters were getting restless. Franklin's economy was buckling. The barter system made bookkeeping impossible. Droughts ruined harvests. Conflicts with native tribes restricted hunting grounds. And without congressional recognition, Franklin couldn't access federal funds or aid. Roads deteriorated. Grain mills stopped turning. And the frontier, once a land of dreams, began to feel like a fever that wouldn't break. Morale in the legislature slipped. Some representatives stopped attending meetings altogether, preferring to stay on their farms and defend what little they had left. Others defected to North Carolina's side, wooed by the promise of stability, or at least a functioning postal system. Sevier kept up appearances. He hosted dinners in Jonesboro, toasted visiting dignitaries with homemade brandy, and sent out annual messages that read like the speeches of a real governor, optimistic, sturdy, and full of frontier grit. But in private, even he began to question the dream. His letters became more introspective. In one, he wrote, "We are holding fast to a vision wrapped in fog. If Congress has not ears to hear us, perhaps they shall hear the thunder of 1,000 rifles." It was part poetry, part threat, but it captured the mood perfectly. Still, there were moments of hope. In early 1787, rumors spread that several delegates in Philadelphia had taken an interest in Franklin's plight. A few senators expressed sympathy. One even suggested the creation of a western buffer state to protect settlers. Franklin's supporters dared to hope. A new petition was drafted, longer, more refined, and printed on proper parchment. It included a detailed description of Franklin's laws, its contributions to the revolutionary cause, and a poetic plea for legitimacy. The petition made it to Congress. It was read, and then promptly tabled. No vote was taken. No resolution passed. Franklin, once again, was left waiting. It was a death by 1,000 delays. By the end of 1787, John Tipton's forces had seized several Franklin-controlled buildings, including parts of Jonesboro. Militia standoffs occurred regularly. Some escalated into firefights. Others ended with whiskey and backslaps. Such was frontier diplomacy. And then came the ultimate humiliation. In a bold move, Tipton's men arrested Sevier's son on charges of treason. The boy was paraded through town in chains and held in a barn under armed guard. Sevier, incandescent with rage, called up the Franklin militia and surrounded Tipton's farm in retaliation. Gunfire erupted. Horses screamed. Smoke curled above the bare hills. The skirmish ended in a draw, but the damage was done. Franklin had become a battlefield not just of ideas, but of blood. By 1788, Franklin was crumbling. Counties declared their renewed loyalty to North Carolina. Judges resigned. Schools closed. Sevier himself was arrested by North Carolina authorities while traveling through the contested region. Though later released, the message was clear: Franklin was finished. And yet, the name lingered. In cabins tucked beneath ridgelines and on hills where corn once swayed, the name Franklin still stirred something in the hearts of old-timers. A pride. A defiance. A memory of what might have been. And for John Sevier, the dream would rise again. By 1788, the state of Franklin was less a government and more a philosophical argument with a militia. But no argument, philosophical or otherwise, is complete without a worthy opponent. And in this case, that opponent was John Tipton, a man as dry as Sevier was dashing, as prickly as a frost-bitten thistle, and as determined to uphold North Carolina's authority as Sevier was to break free of it. Tipton, a former Revolutionary officer himself, was no stranger to conflict. But unlike Sevier's charismatic brawling and romantic saber-rattling, Tipton was the kind of man who would rather win a land dispute with a spreadsheet than a duel. He was a law and order man in a land where both were rare and resented. A stickler for jurisdiction, precedent, and ink signatures, Tipton seemed born to be the enemy of a man like Sevier. So began one of the most comically bitter rivalries in early American history, the feud between the two Johns. Tipton, backed by North Carolina's legislature, declared Sevier a usurper. Sevier, backed by whiskey and sheer enthusiasm, declared Tipton a tyrant. Franklin loyalists mocked Tipton's hairline and called him his Tiptonness behind closed doors. Tipton supporters whispered that Sevier was a reckless warlord whose dream of a new state was built more on ego than principle. The conflict between them wasn't just political, it was theatrical. In 1788, the drama reached its fever pitch. Tipton, determined to reassert North Carolina's rule, seized property belonging to Sevier. Specifically, he confiscated several of Sevier's slaves. This wasn't just an economic blow, it was a deeply personal insult. In frontier culture, a man's household was sacred. To lay hands on another man's household was to declare war. Sevier did not take it lightly. He rallied his supporters, many of whom were former militiamen, frontier warriors, and a handful of hot-headed teenagers itching for glory. They rode toward Tipton's farm near modern-day Johnson City, arriving under the cover of winter. With nearly 150 men and enough firepower to dent a small nation, Sevier laid siege to Tipton's homestead. This was not, mind you, a formal battle. It was a standoff. The Tipton house sat atop a low rise, surrounded by barns, fences, and freshly churned mud. Inside, Tipton had gathered about a dozen loyalists and barricaded the windows with furniture and hay bales. They had food, powder, and a remarkable amount of legal paperwork, because even in siege, Tipton never stopped cataloguing. For 2 days, the two sides exchanged gunfire and insults. "Come out, Tipton, and answer for your thieving ways," Sevier reportedly shouted across the field. "I'll answer once you're back under lawful jurisdiction," Tipton called back. In between musket volleys, local women brought biscuits and news of North Carolina's militia. Tipton's sons, sharp-eyed and foul-mouthed, returned fire from upstairs windows. The yard was littered with powder burns, spent shot, and torn pages from rejected Franklin laws. On the third day, the weather turned. Rain fell in heavy Appalachian sheets. The mud thickened to ankle-deep sludge, and visibility vanished. It was then that reinforcements arrived, North Carolina militia loyal to Tipton. Caught between bad weather and bad odds, Sevier's forces scattered. The Tipton House standoff became legend. But the consequences were real. The arrest warrant for Sevier was dusted off. And though it had been ignored for months, the state now intended to act. Sevier was eventually apprehended in a humiliating roadside arrest. Carried off in shackles, he reportedly quipped to the arresting officer, "I hope you brought good boots, friend. My reputation tends to get muddy." But frontier justice was never straightforward. Within days, Sevier was freed by sympathizers. The jailer, whether bribed or inspired, opened the doors. Sevier walked free and returned to a hero's welcome in Franklin territory. Songs were sung. Babies were named after him. One man reportedly renamed his mule Tipton's Doom. Still, the feud continued. Courts in Franklin and North Carolina issued contradictory rulings. Citizens were unsure whom to obey. Marriages were recorded twice. Taxes were paid twice, or not at all. And in one surreal episode, both Franklin and North Carolina scheduled elections for the same day in the same district. Voters simply chose which table to approach. At the heart of it all stood Sevier and Tipton, two men orbiting one another in a dance of pride and principle. They met occasionally in neutral territory, church steps, militia gatherings, public taverns. Their conversations were always civil. Their eyes never were. Despite the chaos, something beautiful emerged. Franklin, in its dying days, became a laboratory of democracy. Competing legal systems forced residents to think critically about authority. Communities held town meetings not just to discuss crops, but constitutional theory. Even children learned early how to distinguish between Franklin-issued and North Carolina-issued coins. Of course, it couldn't last. Another kind of war smoldered in the pews. Franklin's religious life was as fractured as its politics. While many settlers were loosely Protestant, the Baptists had grown particularly strong and particularly vocal. They preached against Sevier's government, calling it illegitimate and ungodly. Some saw Franklin as a rebellion not just against North Carolina, but against divine order. They accused Sevier of arrogance and Franklin supporters of idolatry. Meanwhile, other sects accused the Baptists of being rabble-rousers and dream-killers. Preachers squared off in makeshift churches. Arguments spilled from pulpits to porches. Scripture was cited, misquoted, and weaponized. And still, somehow, the people kept showing up on Sundays, mostly to pray, partly to eavesdrop on the latest fire and brimstone gossip. Religion in Franklin didn't unify, it divided. But it also gave the people something to do besides feuding, farming, and fermenting corn. By 1787, the air around Franklin crackled, not with lightning, but with human friction. Political tension, religious schisms, broken treaties, and smoldering resentment all jostled for dominance beneath the wide Appalachian sky. The state of Franklin was no longer a newborn frontier dream, it had become a teenager, unpredictable, rowdy, and increasingly disillusioned with the adults in charge. The government John Sevier tried to cobble together in Jonesboro now looked more like a row of tinderboxes stacked shoulder to shoulder than anything resembling coherent leadership. Court sessions were erratic, currency practically worthless, and the only thing everyone could agree on was that they liked whiskey more than taxes. Laws? There were some. But enforcing them was like asking a cat to police a room full of rocking chairs. Sheriffs were often friends of the accused, and juries were composed of neighbors who owed each other favors, debts, or both. Even when a ruling was made, its execution depended less on legal precedent and more on whose family had more rifles. Franklin had slipped into a kind of civil anarchy. The initial optimism had frayed at every edge. Sevier, still swaggering and magnetic, tried to hold it all together. But even Nolichucky Jack couldn't out-wrestle entropy. Franklin didn't fall all at once. It staggered, gasped, fought itself in mirrors. By the time the final skirmishes broke out, it wasn't a war for independence. It was a family feud gone rotten. And even Sevier seemed weary. As 1788 dawned, the writing was on the wall, and in the letters sent to Congress, most of which were ignored. Sevier's appeals for recognition had failed. Supplies ran low. Raids from the Cherokee increased. And North Carolina, fed up with the whole ordeal, started flexing its authority again. Franklin began to splinter. Counties that had once pledged loyalty now drifted away, like planks peeling off a sinking ship. Some locals petitioned to return to North Carolina's fold. Others tried to cling to the Franklin dream. Still others stopped caring entirely and just wanted peace and cheaper whiskey. In desperation, Sevier tried to form new alliances. He flirted with Spain, yes, Spain, sending envoys to seek support from Spanish governors along the Mississippi. The idea? If Congress wouldn't recognize Franklin, maybe a foreign power would. But the thought of siding with Catholic monarchists made even Franklin's most rebellious settlers uneasy. That flirtation, like so many dreams, dried up. In 1789, the United States Constitution had been ratified. A stronger federal government emerged. North Carolina's grip tightened. The courts, the tax collectors, and the official documents all bore Carolina's imprimatur once more. But the people remembered. And memory, in those mountains, is a powerful thing. Tipton, too, mellowed with time. The fires of ideology cooled, leaving behind the embers of personal grudges. But even those slowly faded. In their final years, Sevier and Tipton both served in Tennessee's state government. Sevier became its first governor. Tipton, still grumbling about legality, took a seat in the legislature. They attended the same dinners, signed the same documents, sat at opposite ends of the same room. And so the duel of the governors ended not with a shot, but a sigh. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear their feud in the wind over the mountains, in every spirited town hall meeting, in every vote of protest, in every stubborn soul who refuses to choose between two bad options and instead build something new. Franklin fell. But its spirit, fractious, funny, fiercely independent, lives on. And as for Nolichucky Jack and his Tiptonness, they may have died, but their rivalry is immortal. History, like the mountains of Appalachia, is shaped slowly, carved not only by drama and conflict, but by the quiet persistence of visionaries who refuse to be forgotten. And now, As we stand at the far edge of our journey through the life of John Sevier and the rise and fall of the state of Franklin, it's time to set down the muskets, the proclamations, the petitions, and the feuds, and reflect on what it all meant. Because Franklin failed, yes. But it also succeeded. In its failure, it drew a map not of territory, but of temperament. The state of Franklin may never have been recognized by Congress, but it was unmistakably real. It was real in the same way that the dream of freedom is real long before it's ever written into law. Franklin was a glimmer of what lay ahead, a flicker of possibility in the backwoods, lit by a people who simply refused to wait for permission to govern themselves. And at the center of that spark was John Sevier. Let's not overpolish the man. Sevier was ambitious, sometimes reckless, often defiant. He made enemies and kept them. His charisma carried him, but it also blinded him. His relationship with North Carolina soured not just because of policy but because of pride. But that pride, that same unruly spirit, was also what made him irresistible to so many frontier folk. They saw in Sevier something unfiltered, something familiar. A man who could fight Indians by day and hold court by night, who could settle disputes, lead armies, and still stop to shake hands at church. Sevier wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol. In the 18th century southern backcountry, symbols were as vital as supplies. And for those who had spent their lives being ignored or trampled by distant capitals, Sevier's leadership offered something revolutionary, representation that was local, personal, and responsive. So yes, Sevier was flawed. But his flaws were frontier flaws, loud, gritty, impatient. They made sense in a world where survival demanded instinct more than ideology. The state of Franklin didn't last long, just for years from its hopeful birth to its political demise. But history doesn't measure meaning in longevity. Sometimes a thing lives because it dies too soon. The Founding Fathers wrote a constitution. The people of Franklin lived one. They hammered it out through barter, ballots, and backroom arguments. They didn't have the luxury of grand halls or powdered wigs. They had log cabins and militia rolls. But make no mistake, they were building a nation. And even when that nation collapsed under external pressure and internal divisions, the memory of it endured. Why? Because Franklin made visible something the young United States hadn't yet fully grappled with, that sovereignty is an idea born from experience, not decree. The people of Franklin had governed themselves for years before anyone from Philadelphia ever took notice. And when they asked to be recognized, they weren't really asking. They were stating a fact. And that fact was this: a new kind of American was being born in the Highlands. Fiercely independent. Suspicious of distant power. Loyal to their community's creed. They were inventing a version of citizenship that would echo through every future movement demanding autonomy, states' rights, or self-governance. Franklin, in this light, was less a failed state and more a prototype, a dress rehearsal for what the frontier would continue to demand. In many ways, the true legacy of Franklin isn't found in legal archives or dusty treaties. It lives in Appalachian culture. In the songs, the speech, the defiant hospitality of people who still bristle when told what to do by people who don't know their land. Franklin was an early articulation of the Appalachian identity before it had a name, a brand, or a stereotype. It was born in resilience, in the sense that the rules didn't always fit the ridges, and that when they didn't, you made your own. That spirit, passed down from Sevier's time, still breathes in rural courthouses, school board meetings, and Sunday potlucks. It's there when communities defend their own, when they challenge outsiders, and when they vote in ways that confound the mainstream. It's a legacy that resists simplification. That's what makes Franklin more than a historical curiosity. It's a root system. It feeds how people think about freedom, loyalty, and belonging even now. We cannot ignore how the story of Franklin helped shape America's understanding of federalism, either. The messy negotiations over Franklin's legitimacy and North Carolina's reassertion of control exposed cracks in the Articles of Confederation, cracks that would soon be addressed in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. In fact, Franklin's very existence raised real-time questions about the limits of state authority, the rights of citizens to secede or self-organize, the role of the federal government in mediating disputes between regions. And here's the kicker, those questions never really got resolved. They resurfaced in the Civil War, in the Civil Rights Movement, in modern debates about local control, and in every whisper of secession since. Franklin is part of that conversation. It was an early case study in how American unity is always, to some degree, an argument. And John Sevier was one of its loudest early voices. Of course, it's tempting to turn Sevier into a folk hero, a Washington of the woods. But that does him a disservice. Because John Sevier didn't live in the mythic past. He lived in the awkward present, a time when lines were blurry, loyalties uncertain, and the nation itself still in wet clay. His decisions were often improvisational. His alliances were practical. His speeches lacked polish. But that's what makes him so important. He was a doer, not just a dreamer. The myth of Sevier has its uses, it keeps the legend alive. But the man of Sevier teaches us more. He shows us that leadership isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's loud, grumpy, and sunburnt. Sometimes it wears buckskin instead of brocade. And sometimes it doesn't win. But it leaves a mark anyway. Today, the memory of the state of Franklin is kept alive in museums, roadside plaques, and the pages of local history books. There's even a State of Franklin Track Club and a State of Franklin Bank. You can find John Sevier's name on schools, bridges, and statues across Tennessee. But perhaps his most enduring memorial isn't made of stone. It's the idea that government is a servant, not a master. That liberty is worth improvising for. That even a bunch of backward settlers with no army, no currency, and no formal recognition can still claim their place in history. Franklin reminds us that legitimacy doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes, it comes from below, from the consent of the governed, scratched out in frontier dust. It's natural to ask the what-if questions. What if Congress had admitted Franklin as the 14th state? What if Sevier hadn't clashed with Tipton? What if the Cherokee treaties had gone differently? Would the state have survived? Would it have changed the balance of power in early America? We can't know. But we can say this: Franklin changed the map, not on paper, but in people's minds. It made the idea of new states, new experiments, and new expressions of democracy seem possible. That legacy, that sense of possibility, is what lingers. As we close the book on John Sevier and the state of Franklin, let's remember, this story isn't just about one man or one failed state. It's about the restless energy that animates the human spirit itself. It's about how even a half-built courthouse in a muddy clearing can become a capital. How a cluster of neighbors can become a legislature. How sovereignty is more than a flag, it's a feeling. And Franklin? Franklin gave us a mirror. It showed us how fragile and how fierce self-rule can be. It taught us that democracy is less about institutions and more about people willing to try, to fail, and to try again. So when we look back on that scrappy, short-lived republic nestled in the Appalachian hollers, we do so not with pity, but with a kind of awe. Because Franklin dared to answer a question we're still asking today. What if we could govern ourselves, right here, right now, with no permission but our own? And that question, that sacred, unruly question, isn't going anywhere. Not as long as there are hills and hollers, neighbors and ballots, rebels and dreamers. Not as long as there's a little bit of Franklin in our wild, rebellious hearts. Thank you for listening to Historian's Lullaby. Please like, share, and subscribe. And now, off to sleep.